Welcome to Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. I'm Paula Eddy Wilcox, and today is the third episode with our wonderful guest who is talking about the pivotal moments that make them the leader they are today. I really hope you enjoy the episode. I can't wait to find out what's in store. Welcome to today's episode of Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. I'm Paula Eddy Wilcox, and I'm joined for our final episode. I'm a little bit sad to say because it's been a fascinating conversation, but our final episode with Sarah Le Fevre. Welcome back.
Thank you.
So, Sarah, we've heard so much about your amazing brain, how it works, some of the games that you've created, and the way that you're helping organizations, teams, people to have very, very different conversations in the way that they're leading. But what would be lovely to chat to you today about is a little bit more about you in terms of your leadership, leading self along the way, and your journey that you shared in the first step. But those pivotal moments, you know, we often talk about it like a crucible. You go in one end, something happens in the middle, and you find some strength or other to bring yourself out the other side as a changed person as a result. So without further ado, let's dig in, and I'll hand it over to you.
So I talked a little bit about my ADHD in the first episode, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think the first thing I'd like to talk about is something that happened probably 5 or 6 years ago, and which led to I've kind of gone through my career sort of switching between employment and self-employment. So I think I just wanted to talk a little bit about what led to my latest episode of self-employment, if you like. So some time ago, I was working in a space that I was really happy with, doing a lot of work in environmental leadership programs and so on, working with big corporate organizations. They've always been my preferred audience. And I was involved in creating and delivering large-scale programs around sustainability leadership. So usually for high-level leaders within organizations. And it was great fun, and it was really impactful. We'd create these really engaging programs that went on between sort of 4 days and 2 weeks, working with people. So it was in-depth stuff, and there was also an element of citizen science involved. So they were very, very immersive programs. So people would be doing sort of experimenting during programs, finding out first-hand details about things that were happening. The one that I used to mostly work with was water quality issues. So we'd be sort of testing water and finding out about nutrient pollution and so on. And what used to happen with these is they used to be really, really transformative for people, these programs. People would come out at the end, and I've been on programs where at the end of the program, the attendees had been moved to tears for what they found out, and they'd be really, really fired up. And like a lot of these kind of programs, the end result would be an action plan. So they'd spend the last half day or so of the program doing action planning about what they were going to do when they went back into the organization. But there were two things that used to generally happen, and both of which were rather disappointing. So on some of the programs, people would be creating really, really ambitious and worthwhile action plans. And a lot of the people that we were working with were in organizations, a lot of financial organizations. So these are, and there were high up leaders within the organization. So these were people who had quite a lot of clout. They could be doing things, creating new financial products, for example, to help with the fight against climate change. This was the idea, and this was what the organisation I worked for, this was what their basic function was, to get people to that position. So we'd have two situations. I'd say some of the programs, people would be creating really, really ambitious action plans, and then we'd follow up with them 6 months later and nothing would have happened. So despite the fact that these people were really, really, really fired up, and it wasn't like they were just sort of paying lip service to it. They really wanted to do these things, but the learning and the impact would die on contact with business as usual, because there just wasn't they weren't able to do it. There would be a number of different things. They wouldn't have time. They didn't have the support of their leaders when they got back to actually do these things. They wouldn't be able to practice the new skills they'd learned because their job simply didn't allow them to practice those skills. There were all sorts of things. So that was really disappointing, especially when you knew the impact that these programs had had on people. The second one, which was possibly even worse, would be that you would get to the end of the program, and along the way, again, people would have had quite an impactful and moving experience. They'd be learning an awful lot of stuff about the state the planet's in and where we're at, and a lot of this was very, very scary stuff. And what would happen on some of the programs with that in mind is people would get to the end of the program and they'd be so overcome by the enormity of it all that they would just be believing that there's nothing they could do, that it was hopeless. So instead of people coming up with these impactful sort of action plans, they would just focus on what they felt was in their control, which by the end of it was very little. So you'd get to the end and you'd be working with sometimes C-suite people, and they would literally come up with action plans like, well, we could move the recycling bins, or we could bring in our own coffee cups, because they didn't feel like anything else was in their control, that all they could deal with was these really small footprint kind of, organizational footprint things. So that was like really disappointing as well. And these, obviously for the organization, these programs weren't cheap. This was a significant financial. So both of these things were quite disappointing. And so I kind of went, I can't be doing this anymore. It's just too draining, because I'm affected by all of this as well. But it doesn't feel like it's having any impact. So I went, right, I'm going on my own again. So two things came out of that. And the first one was I created, and again, the ADHD brain, this is still an unfinished project, but I created a new framework for learning, for organizational learning, which took into account the fact that what we're actually doing when we're doing learning is we're doing change. So there is no difference between learning and change. But what we don't get, that if you're working as a change management or sort of within that change setting, you've got a much bigger purview than people who work in learning. So if we're working in learning, we're really given a very, very narrow set of powers, if you like. Those set of powers focus on learning programs, so we're sort of, our purview is a very, very narrow set of either events or content. And those are the two tools that we have. But we don't have any powers over the larger system. So we have no control over what happens to people when they get back into the organisation. We have no control over that business as usual piece. We have, we can maybe follow up 6 months later to ask what people are doing, but we've got no control over what people are doing. We have no control over what systems are in place, what the culture is, etc., etc. So I started to recognise that this is why sort of learning was dying on contact with business as usual, because there's so much which is outside our control. And I ended up drawing it as a little diagram, so a 3-circle diagram, thinking about an organisation in terms of its actors, its activities, and its landscape. So the actors, if you want to bring about a change through learning, the actors are not just the learners. They're not just the people that are have turned up to your particular learning program, but they're anybody who has will have an impact on the change. So they could be those people's leaders. They could be those people. They could be the customers that are impacted by that. So all of those actors have some impact or are impacted by the change that you want to bring about. Then you've got activities, and activities are things that happen within the organisation. And again, within the scope of a change, there will be activities that are carried out or are happening within the organisation that have some kind of impact on that change or are impacted by it. And then you've got landscape. So landscape would be there'll be tangible landscape, things like computer systems, furniture, general kit, all of that tangible stuff. But there's also the intangible landscapes, the culture, the unwritten rules that people are acting under. So this is all quite utopian. So what I've done is created this model which without change, without what we do as learning professionals changing, it would not happen, if you like. But it's kind of like an ideal, it's a model of what happens. And if we look at where we currently are as learning professionals, our sort of purview is a tiny little ellipse which overlaps activities and actors. So we're acting with a limited set of actors, our learners, and we're acting on a limited set of activities, that content or those events that we create for learning. But what we really need to be doing is having a view which is all of those circles within the scope that we're looking at. So that was the first thing I did. And out of that has really come, that's really sort of informed how I work with the games-based learning now, because I'm constantly trying to think, how does that actually fit in within this framework? So that for me was a very, very pivotal point. And I guess the other pivotal point has been the ADHD. Finding out
for a second. So just to say, really, then that first pivotal moment, I think what I'm hearing, Sarah, is that it's really changed the way that you look at work that you're doing and the way that you're supporting people. Would that to say?
Yeah. So really, I mean, I was, as a learning professional, I'd love to be able to be in the situation where I've got control over all three of those circles. Yeah. That isn't the state I've got at the moment. But what I have got now is this framework which helps me to consider and ask the right questions when I'm putting a learning program together, to make sure that the learning that I create has the best chance of surviving business as usual. That the people that are coming along to the programs are going to have the support of their line managers. They're going to have the time to actually practice, and it means that I can advise and consult and kind of say, well, yes, you want that, but actually, if I give you that isn't going to have the impact you want, because there's this bit over here which is just going to make it all go away.
Yeah.
So yeah, and yeah, thinking about the actors, I think that's been sort of like the really, really interesting piece, because that you then start to think, well, it's, if you're doing a leadership program, for example, that you invite people along and you drill a leadership framework into them and you think the job's done, but of course that's going to, what is needed there is that those people need to be supported by those above them to actually practice those new skills. But it also requires that the people who are going to be led agree to what the way in which they're going to be led and how they're going to be led, and sort of being able to have those conversations at the point of sort of briefing, I guess, before creating those leadership programs, has been really, really helpful to me, to be able to sort of articulate to people what results they can expect and what they can't expect if they're you know, they're trying to do it the way they're trying to do it.
Yeah, and you know, as you're talking, Sarah, what's interesting to me is something that we briefly touched on in the previous episode, was around how people are sent on some sort of learning or training course, and that, you know, how are we measuring the value add, the results in 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 years time. Your pivotal moment is all around it wasn't having the impact it needed to have, therefore you decided to change what you were doing. And you know, I'm delighted to hear that that's what it's done for you, because it's music certainly to my ears, because we do want to have that lasting impact in what we're doing as leaders, you know, whether that be through the training that we're giving, the team that we're leading ourselves. Is everything we do, we want to make sure we're getting the most value, and that it has that lasting impact and gives us the change, as you rightly alluded to, in terms of learning and change being interchangeable, if you like, and having it last, you know, well beyond the end of them walking out the room at the end of day 2.
Yeah. So the model I've created, the intention is that it represents a learning organisation, so an organisation that continues to learn. But one of the things that I really struggled, so how can I explain it? So it has a number of stages as well. So I have a base model which kind of represents the overlap between actors, landscape, and activities. But I also, it can be used as a tool for learning design as well. So it goes through an analysis stage and a practice stage. And then there is this kind of final model, which represents the system once that kind of process is in place, once you're practicing the things that the model represents. And for quite a long time, the overlapping piece in the central was called growth. And I really struggled with that, because growth has a lot of implications around getting bigger, making more money, and so on. Although that wasn't the meaning of the word growth I had in there. It was kind of, you know, personal growth, learning growth, if you like. So I struggled for quite a long time with actually coming up with an appropriate word that didn't have all this sort of getting bigger, getting more profitable baggage, which isn't necessarily what I wanted. So in the end, I settled for flourishing. So the idea is that what you're doing, if the system is working correctly, if it's a true learning organisation, then you're consistently moving towards flourishing.
Yeah.
But ironically, what that also brought out for me is that process is never over. So the kind of model that you've got where you build a learning program and that ticks your box, it's really kind of faulty, because you can't ever, if you ever reach that done stage, then you stop being a learning organisation, because you're no longer learning.
Absolutely right, Sarah. Got it. As soon as you said it, I was like, no, because if you stop growing, you stand still. You're in danger of becoming irrelevant. You know, the word flourish. You know, you're always working towards flourishing, means you are always growing, learning. You know, in the non-traditional sense, of course, for growing, as in bigger and profitable, etc.
Yeah,
I understand why you were, you know, the way you explained not wanting to use that word. Flourish is great, because it is about people succeeding, us succeeding, the organisation succeeding. Whatever that looks like is very different to saying it's all about the profit. You know, which you know, some organisations are super focused on that.
Yeah.
As we said, I don't know if it's first or second episode, if you support the people, support them to develop in the right way, give them the right tools to do a great job, everything else follows, including the profit, with some great direction, of course. And that is simplified view of it, of course, but I think people will get the sentiment. So brilliant. So tell us about your other pivotal moment then in terms of your ADHD.
Well, I guess it was just the realization of that's what it was. So it sounds crazy, but there's sort of a feeling throughout life of being slightly off kilter, I guess, and sort of discovering that my brain works slightly different from other people, and that would be generally frowned upon. But of course, up until relatively recently, there was no recognition that adults could even have ADHD, and certainly it was seen as something that boys had. Which is it's one of the difficulties. I mean, I don't know how it works in other countries, but certainly within the NHS and in the UK, it's quite difficult to be recognised as an adult female with ADHD. But what basically happened, again, it was another one of those things, sort of like snippets of information that come your way, and it was probably about 6 years ago. I read an article about ADHD. It was quite. It wasn't a sort of paper or anything. It was kind of it was within a magazine. I can't remember where it was, and I read this, and I was thinking, oh, this is me. This is so crazy. This is everything that I've experienced. So I started looking into it a bit more. Started looking at sort of academic papers and stuff. But with that realization, it was really liberating, because one of the things that had happened to me repeatedly throughout my sort of adolescence onwards, throughout my adult life, was bouts of depression, because things aren't working quite the way that everybody thinks they should be working. And so you're finding quite often you're in situations where you don't fit in, or the way that you look at things is kind of different or frowned upon. But I've also got other problems. I mean, here's an absolutely crazy one. So this is an example of sort of like my day-to-day ADHD-ness. So this kind of fascination with sponge thing in some ways is really good, and it's really good for games design, because we've constantly got ideas coming, but in other ways it can be quite debilitating. So in my spare time, I do a lot of crafting, and I'm quite getting into sewing at the moment, thanks to the sewing bee. So I bought a pattern off the internet for a pair of trousers. And very foolishly, I did that at the beginning of the week. I did it on a Monday when I should have done it on a Friday. Because what happened, because I'd done it on the Monday, is I was now in possession of this pattern, and it's going, read me, read me, read me, read me. So very foolishly, I read it. And there were loads and loads of new techniques that I would need to do in order to make these trousers, which was really good news for me, because it's like, oh, great, I'm going to be learning some new stuff. But because I read it on a Monday, then it's the single these new techniques are the single thing which is occupying my mind. So I'm at work, and all I'm thinking is flat felled seams, flat felled seams, flat felled seams. But it gets worse. So I go to bed on the Monday night, and my brain goes flat felled seams, flat felled seams. And I literally, having read the instructions, my brain then decides to rehearse this all night. Oh, wow. So I must have done in my head, about 120 flat felled seams over that Monday night. Same thing happened Tuesday night. So my brain is constantly rehearsing this new technique that I'm going to be doing. On Wednesday, I went, oh, this is ridiculous. I'm going to have to, I know I'm doing X, Y, Z today, but I'm going to have to put that to one side. So the first thing I did when I got up on Wednesday morning is I got my sewing machine out, and I did one flat felled seam, and that got it out of my head onto the fabric, and then it was gone, and I could then rest. But this is typical. So, in the past, before I discovered ADHD, you'd go and tell people stuff like that. Oh, last night I did this 120 times and I couldn't get to sleep. And they'd look at you. What? No, that isn't normal. People don't do that. But when you find this stuff out about yourself, it's really liberating, because you can then start to deal with it, and B, kind of defend yourself when people are kind of saying, that's just wrong. You shouldn't be thinking that way, which I've been told, oh, so many times in my adult life, you shouldn't think like that. No, don't think like that. Think like this. You can't do that, of course. You can't. You
Of
can't.
course you can't. And, you can't put people into a box.
Yeah, but it does happen very much to people who, and so it's been very, very liberating, and has allowed me to kind of give myself permission to work the way that works for me.
And that's the really important phrase there, Sarah. It's given you permission to work in the best way that works for you. And, well before, years before I was a coach, I've always been non-judgmental of others. What works for you might not work for me, but that's okay. Because if we get the same result, it doesn't matter, does it?
No.
I say same result, but depends on what you're going for. But actually, the way that you do it and get to it may be way, way better result than the way I do it and get to it. That might be achieve what we wanted to achieve, but yours has got bells on as well. If you know what I mean. So it's really fascinating to me to see still, and this is a world problem that we won't solve in this podcast, but that people are so judgmental of others. That brings me great sadness that they can't embrace that difference for good and see the benefits of being who you are and the way that you come at a problem, for example, versus who I am and the way that I come at a problem and try to solve it.
To be fair to other people, though, and to myself, I suppose, without that knowledge, it is quite difficult, because some of the stuff that I found myself doing, even to me, it felt quite bizarre at the time. So I said to be fair to other people, without the knowledge of what's going on, or that there are these developmental differences and these sort of cognitive differences between people, it can be quite difficult, I guess. And
I do get that, Sarah, but again, I've got a family with neurodiversity, so husband and are both severely dyslexic.
My husband's dyslexic, and he found out late as well.
Yeah, well, actually, hubby found out, when did he find out? About 25, I suppose. But for my daughter, thankfully, we're all much more clued up these days, and managed to get her tested. Again, we had to do it privately. The wait was too long on the NHS. We knew she needed help for exams and things like that, so we ended up doing it privately, and found a really fantastic lady to help us with that. But that, for my husband's story, that idea that he was the naughty kid that played up in school, he's one of the most intelligent people I know. And when you talked about your husband sending you snippets of things, Sarah will be interested in that. Stuart does it all the time to me, and yes, I am interested. I wouldn't see half the things I see. He didn't share stuff with me. And the podcast, and Stuart, Paula, come and listen to this bit, or whatever. Because I suppose there's two things. One, I have so much going on, so I don't think I've got time. But maybe I don't make time either to go searching for extra things, in the way Stuart just listens to this stuff all the time. It's how he absorbs information. So, around the house, if he's next door in the day, I can hear the podcast going at the same time. Whatever he's doing, he's absorbing and learning all the time, which is just incredible. And, I've always been in awe of how his brain works. So talking to you today has just been fascinating, and an extension of talking to which is a great and fascinating experience on a daily basis.
Thank you.
Not at all. I mean, you've shared so much and been so generous with your information about what you do over 3 episodes, Sarah, and I'm so grateful to you for joining us on Game of Leadership, and I really hope you've also enjoyed and got something from this.
It's been great fun.
Oh, good. Well, thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of week, And I know that we'll keep in touch, over whatever it's over, but we'll certainly meet up for coffee because we're not too distant away, I don't think. Can't remember where you're based, but we'll work that out.
We will.
So thank you so much, and have a great rest of holidays and the week.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. This has been the third episode and final episode for a little while anyway, with our guest, who shared their pivotal moments that make them the leader they are today. Again, I talk about uniqueness a lot. Every guest story and their pivotal moments, the challenges they faced, the issues they faced over the years to get to where they are now, and how they pulled themselves through all of that, makes them the leader they are today, and each one of those stories is unique and different. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with them and see what that meant for them. Now, once again, it's your turn to reflect on what you've heard today, see what resonates for you, and think about what that might mean for your leadership moving forwards. I'm Paula Eddy Wilcox, and I look forward to welcoming you back next time on Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. Bye for now.